In this video, we're going to be talking about the Mendix domain model. So if you're just getting started with the Mendix project, one of the first tasks that you need to think about is how to structure your domain model, which really is the foundation of your project on which everything else will be built. So if you don't have a solid domain model, then you'll find that the rest of your project will be incredibly difficult. And so that's why I made this presentation to help you all understand more conceptually what a domain model is and how to structure it in a way that makes sense for your project. So to get started, what is a domain model? A domain model, really simply put, is just a visual representation of your database. So you're defining all of the different tables or entities, is what they're called in Mendix, that are associated with each other that will house your data for your project. And any project will need some form of a database or domain model. It might use different syntax and different different formats, but in essence, any software application is using the same logic to structure its data that you use in Mendix. And so a domain model really isn't unique to Mendix, but there are certain things that you need to understand in order to create a good structurally sound domain model before you're able to actually build a cohesive application. So to get started, before we look at like Mendix specific things, I want to take a step back and just imagine your data in a spreadsheet. So if you've used Excel or Google Sheets, you're probably pretty familiar with this idea that in a spreadsheet, you have your data in rows and columns, and then you might have different sheet names down here. And so just imagine for any project you might be doing, maybe it's like um, you're keeping track of your class schedule, and you want to keep track of all your different assignments or something in a spreadsheet. So with that in mind, think about in that type of project, what would the sheet names be? Let's say that it was a slightly more complex thing and you maybe had multiple sheets. You might have the courses sheet, you might have an assignment sheet. You get the idea. Just that is the first really critical thing you have to answer when thinking about a domain model structure as well. Is like if you were doing this in Excel or Google Sheets, what would the sheet names be down here for your data? And the next thing you'd need to think about is inside of each sheet, what are the column headers that you would be putting? Like if this is the course sheet, sheet one is courses, then what types of columns would you need up here to correctly label your data for courses? Maybe you'd need things like a course name or a course number or a description or credit hours. You get the idea. Each one of those would be a column name. So really that exact same practice that we just did is exactly the same train of thought that you can use when building out a Mendix domain model. Um, so to give you guys an idea of how that would look, let's look at this example or this practice scenario to give you guys a little bit more practice in thinking in this way. So you are storing information about different authors, the books they have written, and the themes that they emphasize in their writing. How would you organize this information inside of a spreadsheet? So using the same structure that we just used talking about courses, how would we do that, apply that same method to this scenario here? So this is probably how I would do it. Yours might look slightly different, and this data is somewhat arbitrary, but this allows you to kind of see like a general idea. So we have an author sheet, and inside of author, we have maybe the author's first name and last name, a pseudonym if they have one, and then a couple other data values. For the book table or the book spreadsheet, I guess, we might have the title, the genre, when the date or the date released, number of pages in the book, and a short summary. And then for themes, we might have just the type of theme it is and then a description. And so you'll see really quickly that like this type of format allows you to really quickly think of like how you want to structure your data, and you can apply these exact same principles in a Mendix domain model. So if we were to translate this into Mendix, you can just remember this really simple formula. So the sheets, so going back to here, the sheet names down here, so like author, book, theme, those are your entity names. So you'll need three entities in this case, one for author, one for book, and one for theme. And then the columns, so each of those column headers are the attributes inside of entities. And so really this is all you need to remember to translate your data from like a spreadsheet model into a Mendix domain model. Sheets equal entities and columns equal the attributes. So this is just a reiteration of what we just talked about. So this is an actual Mendix domain model now. And you'll notice that all I did was I took that author, book, and theme, and I made them into their own three separate entities. And then I gave each of those columns their own attribute inside of their respective entity. And so that's really all you need to visualize when you are creating your own domain model. And I feel like this is a really good practice if you're struggling to come up with the different entities and attributes you might need. So for the second practice, let's imagine that you are creating an application for a doctor's office to keep track of all their patients' appointments. And you need to store information about the doctors, the patients they're seeing, and then each of those patients' appointments. So how would you create a domain model for this scenario? I would encourage you guys to just pause the video here and try and work through this scenario on your own to just reinforce some of the concepts that we just talked about. Okay, so in the next part of this presentation, I want to talk about how associations work in Mendix. So in a domain model, there's kind of two different conceptual aspects to creating a cohesive domain model. The first is creating your entities, which we just did. But the second part is telling Mendix how they're related to each other. And this is called associations, how they're associated. So really, in order to do that, let's first just talk about what are associations. So they're just the relationships between entities, and they define which entities are dependent on each other. So just a note about this, this does not mean that every single entity will have an association with each other. You might think of like two completely unrelated entities in your domain model that like don't need to communicate at all, and that's totally fine. But you'll definitely have entities that are related and might be interdependent on each other for data. And so that's what an association is. So let's take a look at the three different types of associations. First is probably the most simple, is a one-to-one association. So I think that this graphic right here illustrates this really well. One-to-one just means that if you have a table over here, or an entity, I mean, an entity over here and an entity over here, one of these will have a relationship with just one of these other ones. So in this case, it would be one person has one passport. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Like if you were to say it out loud, one person has one passport, that does make sense, that there would be kind of this person to passport relationship, and it would be one-to-one. So the next association, and this is probably the most common association that you'll see, is a one-to-many relationship. So what this means is that one entity over here could have many associations, or could have many relationships with like an entity over here. So in this case, one customer has many accounts, or it could be one customer has many products or many items that they're buying. This is like a really common scenario that you would see a lot. I'm trying to think of some other really good ones. One course has many topics, or one author, going back to our author example, one author could write many books. So you can kind of get the idea. And this is illustrated in Mendix with like a 1 here and a star, and the star just means many. And so that's what that means. And the last association, the third one, that's probably the least common, but definitely still has a use, is a many-to-many relationship. And this is probably the conceptually most difficult one to understand. But essentially what this means is that um, the entity over here and the entity over here could be interrelated in like a lot of different ways. It's not necessarily one to many or one to one. So in this case, many customers could buy many different products. And a way that I like to think about this that's a little bit more intuitive for me is if you think about one customer, obviously one customer could have many products, but if we flip that, the same product could be bought by many different customers. And that's the key here is that's what makes it many to many is that if you were to flip that logic and say it out loud again, it would make sense. So one customer could have many products and one product could be bought by many different customers. And that's what makes it many to many. So in your own project, when you're trying to decide what association to give between different entities, I feel like verbally speaking out loud and just thinking through these associations using this formula that we just talked about is a really helpful way to conceptualize how entities are related to each other. So one blank entity has, or one or many blank entities have one or many of this other entity. So for example, one student has one transcript. That makes sense. One author has many books. And that's a one to many. And then going back to our author book theme example, many themes could exist in many books. So that's going back to the idea that a book could have many different themes inside of it, but the same theme could appear in many different books. And so that's what makes it many to many. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the discussion about associations. So hopefully that will be helpful for you for figuring out how to make entities interrelated to each other, because having those associations is critical to make sure that you can grab the right data that you need and make sure that it's related to each other so that you can use it in your application. Otherwise, your entities will just be floating in space and they won't know how to communicate with each other. So for the last part of this video, I want to talk about entities versus objects. And this is a really common misconception for people who are just starting out with Mendix. So entities, that's what we've just been talking about during this video. Entities are the structures that you're defining in your domain model. So those are like the blue boxes that you're making in your Mendix domain model, but they're not the data itself. Think about an entity as having a blank spreadsheet where you have all of the columns labeled and all of like the little tabs on the bottom. All the sheets have names too, but there's no data in the actual spreadsheet. So that's what the entity would be, is just like the definition of this is the data that I'm defining, but it's not the data itself. And that's a really key distinction. Objects are the actual instances of data in your project. And so the objects would be the actual rows in a spreadsheet. So if you imagine like a spreadsheet having, 4 different columns with different column headers, and then you start defining rows inside of that spreadsheet, those would be the objects. And this is really important to understand because, and this is just a reiteration. So these right here would be the objects, not the attributes or the entity itself. This is a really important distinction because when you create a new Mendix project, you will first create your domain model, but there will be no actual data loaded inside of your project yet. It will just be like Mendix will know the structure of your data, but not actually have any data inside of it yet. And so you actually have to be the one to upload some data into your application. So there's a few different ways you can do that. I've just highlighted the 3 most common ways. And the way that I would personally recommend is, especially when you're testing your project, is to just create new objects manually with using Mendix's new edit pages. And so what those are they're like pages that you can generate in Mendix from your domain model that essentially give you like a spreadsheet style view of your data. And so it's really simple to do, actually. All you have to do to generate this new edit page is you right click on an entity, and this is the menu that you'll see when you right click on an entity, and then you click generate overview pages right here. And that will create overview pages that will have a new edit page and then like a spreadsheet view for each entity in your project. So then what you can do is you can navigate to those pages with a button or from a navigation item in your like menu nav bar. And when you click into an overview page, what you'll see is like a spreadsheet of that entity. So it'll literally almost have the exact same format as like a Google sheet where you see like all the rows of your data, the columns that are labeled, and then a little button that says, create a new entity for whatever you just created. And that's a really simple way to add new data. And that's probably the way I would recommend at the start. Another way that you can do it that you'll probably end up doing a lot in your project is using the create object activity inside of a microflow or a nanoflow. And what this is doing is that's like saying insert a new row in my spreadsheet. That's literally all that this activity is saying. And then the third way, which you most likely won't need to use unless you're using a lot of data, is there's actually a way in Mendix where you can import data from a spreadsheet or like a .csv file. If you do prefer to use that method when you get closer to like deploying your application, then there's actually a really nice module in the Mendix marketplace that allows you to quickly do that. So those are the three major ways that you can actually add data to your project. So just make sure that you understand this distinction before you start building. Otherwise, you might get a little confused at what data is actually in your project. So that was the presentation. Hopefully this was helpful in allowing you to understand a little bit more conceptually what a domain model is and how to get started on your applications.